take a feel for it so you're comfortable.
Someone's calling for me. Something's calling for me again.
Devil is back again, so I know I'll never look back again. The devil is back again, so I know I'll never look back again. The devil is back again, so I know I'll never look back again. The devil is back again, so I know I'll never look back again. Back again.
Oh, devil, I'm back for a while. Till I pick up the phone, look for your number and dial. Oh, devil, I'm in my own hell. And deep inside, I'm sure I got it all by myself. Someone's calling for me. Something's calling for me again.
Devil is back again, so I know I'll never look back again. The devil is back again, so I know I'll never look back again. Devil is back again, so I never look back again. Devil is back again, so I know I'll never look back again. Back again.
Oh, I know, same old thing, same old show. Oh, I know, same old thing, some show control. Oh, I know, same old thing, same old show. Oh, I know, same old thing, some show control.
Time don't make it no pleasure without pain, no love without heartbreak. Perspective, reflection's sake. When we were young, forever seemed the longest time. To our naive tongues and the trust in our hope-filled eyes. For all my days, for all my days. Now that I've got your life, I won't let it go to waste. Time was told me we're scared the most of these things we can't control. No, oh, understand the folly of our own, that we dwell on our mistakes. The chances we're too afraid to take, they take their toll. Intellects won't save your souls. Indifference a choice, you know. So marry me in your mother's maiden white, in your father's eyes so blue as the southern sky. And when I die, when I'm dead and gone, turn to the dust and dirt where I belong. Pray my love will linger on. Pray my love will linger on. For all my days, for all my days. Now that I've got your life, I won't let it go to waste. For all my days, for all my days, I pray my life won't go to waste. remind me my resting place. In hearts like these, oh, in love like this, the stars align in the sky, you sing. In love of mine, oh, stay the night, as long as the love is left in your eyes. It's for the love in your heart. 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 You don't have my number, but we don't need each other now. We don't need the city, the creed or the culture now. 'Cause I feel the love, feel the love. I feel the love, feel the love. I feel the streets are not pulling me down. So people of the city, I don't need your counsel now, and I don't need your good advice. You don't have my love, it's tough. You don't have my number. We don't need each other now. The creed or the culture, we can move beyond it now. Now the wolf is knocking at my door. Bang, bang, it asks for more. Stand here, we stand tall. We can move beyond these walls. And I don't need your counsel. Now I don't need these city streets. And I don't need that good advice. 'Cause we can move beyond it now. You don't have my number. And we don't need each other now. The creed or the culture. You don't have my love, it's tough.
Good morning and welcome. Thank you for not going on the excursions. I hope you get to go on one later, but this will be an excursion in information and scintillating information at that. My name is Monica Eng. I'm a reporter with Axios Chicago. Today we've got a fantastic panel that is going to dig deep, but not too deep for people who aren't experts to understand planes, trains, and green supply chains, what the future is of sustainable mobility. So to kick things off, I would like one of our panelists, Mr. Al-Qadi, to introduce himself, followed by everyone else to tell me who you are, what you do, and what your connection to sustainable transportation is. Kick it off, please.
Okay, I'm Imad Al-Qadi. I work with the University of Illinois, and I direct the Illinois Center for Transportation. Shall I go and kick it
Yes,
off?
yeah.
Okay. So I thought we'd just start with a few slides here to make sure that we are all on the same page, if I can get them here. As you all know, that 80% of all the global trade, they go through different modes of the transportation, if it's plane, rail, and so on. And in the United States, we are responsible for 25% of that share at almost 25 million tons. If we look at, this is for North America, if we look at the United States, that will be around 18% of the global share. Because of that, there will be a global greenhouse energy or greenhouse gases that is going to be developed, and transportation globally is responsible for 15% of that. And if we look into the roadway, that's almost 75%, and freight is responsible for 29% of that. Now, if we look at the United States, it is responsible for 29% of all the greenhouse gases that it's produced, and accordingly, we need to have a quick look at the transportation part. Every 3 years, they have data about the emission that is related to the road, and they publish it 2 years after that. So this data here is the latest that it's available, and it shows here where each state stands when it comes to the global warming and the greenhouse emission. Where, for example, we're in the state of Illinois, which we have the third largest miles in the country. We are responsible for we are ranked at 9 when it comes to the greenhouse gases. So if we go and look into the freight will be increased by 50% by 2050, and accordingly it will be impacted by many things, including the labor. The drivers right now, we have a shortage of 80,000, and this number will increase to 160,000 by 230, and this is very significant. There is many technologies that have been evolved, and also there is a gap in the infrastructure that's going to be impacting our infrastructure. So I'm going to have just 2 quick things to show you the things that have been advanced and is going to be impacting our infrastructure. First is the platoons. Platoons, usually the trucks, they drive like 200 to 250 feet apart, and with the platoons, they're going to be driving much, much closer, maybe like 50 feet or 60, 70 feet. This is going to be saving us money because of the reduced emission, but at the same time, that's going to be reducing the congestions. And if we have more connectivity, the advantage is going to be more. But at the same time, that might create a problem for us regarding the channelized traffic will cause damage to the roads and also create more cracks. Accordingly, we came up with this. If you look very specific into the switch we have now, we can ask the platoons by connections to drive at different areas exactly, and that will be reducing the damage to the pavement and actually increase the service life. So here in this case, we are changing this challenge that we have into an opportunity, and the state of Illinois has already looked into the platoonable interstate system that we have. We have during the peak hour, 87% of our system platoonable, and off-peak hours, they are around 93%. Now, the other problem here that we're going to be facing in freight is the electrification. As the trucks, as you can see here, if we are putting a battery, there will be a difference of 9 kips. Now, this 9 kips, with the increase in the load that we applied for the trucks that they are using alternative fuel, that
Sorry,
will
can
be
you tell
82.
us what a kip is?
I'm sorry?
Sorry, for those who don't know, what's a kip?
Oh, kip is 1,000 pounds. I'm sorry. So I'll go back and say that there will be a change of 9,000 pounds, and the United States bill 2 years ago, they allow us to go with electrical and different trucks that they are using alternative fuel to go to 82,000 pounds. So we have still 7,000 pounds that we need to deal with. That will be increase the damage to our infrastructure, and what we can do, if we can keep them the same, we're going to end up with another issue here, and this issue is more trucks going to be moving the same load, and we just found recently that this number is going to be at 18%. So we're going to have 18% more trips, which is going to put more strain on our infrastructure. So the alternative, if we reduce the weight of the battery, we're going to end up now putting maybe the payload that it's needed, but now we're going to have a slower range of travel, which means that we're going to charge much faster. So moving forward here, as the penetration of these trucks is going to be into our roads, we're going to be seeing a change of 2.5%. When we have 2.5% penetration, we're going to be seeing a change in the cost and the emission at the beginning. As this penetration is increasing, we're going to see the big advantage. So at the beginning, we're going to be expecting some change. Of course, because of the cost of the e-trucks is higher and many other factors here. One thing that I wanted here to end up with is, if we're going to be looking at this, we have to work together. We need to look at the whole life cycle assessment from the cradle to the grave for each one, if it's the electrical trucks or if it's the roads and so on. One last slide here is we are working with the Department of Energy on a project which we are trying to develop a national hub for the freight data, and this one in collaboration with University of California at Irvine, as well as the Aragon Lab. And we are trying from that to develop models that will allow us to make a decision which route will be the best in order to considering the cost and the emission. And we'll be having a test bed here in Chicago as well in LA. So here's the example. If we have some goods coming from China that's going to be using a marine, we will not be looking just at the ton mile, we'll be looking at the time that it's going to take. So that's part of the analysis we'll do. When it comes to the LA, it might be using a train until it's going to get to Chicago, and after that a truck. So for each one of them, we're going to be looking how much is going to be impacting the economy as well as the emission. And based on that, we will be finding what's the best alternative or mode of alternative for transporting these goods. So I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you so much for that really fascinating overview of freight and what the possibilities are for sustainable freight. All right, let's start down at the end with an introduction and your connection to sustainable transportation.
Sure. So my name is Christine Ravelli. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer of Finnair. Finnair is the flag carrier of Finland, which is a country in the Nordics in Europe. And my connection to sustainable transportation. Of course, we are an airline, but also we are very heavily involved both with our government of Finland as well as with industry bodies such as IATA to try to get the conversation around how we are going to decarbonize the industry, moving more toward realistic steps that we can take not only now but going forward.
Thank you so much. Rebecca.
I'm Becky Hensley. I'm with CSX Transportation. CSX is a freight railroad here in the U.S. We operate east of the Mississippi. There's 6 Class 1 railroads that operate in this space, and I'll just say, because we're in Chicago, all 6 railroads come together here in Chicago. So about 40% of all U.S. freight traffic goes through Chicago, and it's a huge market for all of us. One thing to consider too on freight moving by rail over truck is the function that each rail car you see, each carload, is approximately 3 or 4 truck worths of moving materials. So for every truck we can take off of the road and put on rail, it saves taxpayer dollars. All the rail lines are actually owned by the freight companies, by the railroads. We operate over 20,000 miles of track, and we pay for those assets. We have responsibility to pay for the bridges and track and all the rest. So when you do a comparison of how freight is moving, it is advantageous for the global markets to be thinking about how we can influence a modal shift off of roads, off of trucks, onto rail where it's practical and makes sense.
Thanks so much. Eric.
Great. Well, good morning. Thanks for having me, and it's great to see the turnout. My name is Eric Burkerts. I'm the Chief Growth Officer for LanzaJet. We are based in Deerfield, Illinois, but we operate globally. We are a sustainable aviation fuels technology developer and licensor, but we also produce fuel by building and operating biorefineries. Our first commercial facility is in Soperton, Georgia, and then we have multiple other projects in flight around the world. We're building a facility in the UK in partnership with British Airways. We have a joint venture in India with Indian Oil Corporation. We're building a facility in Japan with a large Japanese refiner, and then we have a project in Australia. We also have a project still fairly early in development here domestically, where Southwest Airlines is the off-taker. My responsibility is focused on technology licensing and business development. I also run the team that does our project origination and project development work, and then policy, government affairs, and regulatory also reports up to me. Pretty big charter, pretty exciting charter. I may say a few words about aviation, and Christine can certainly add as well. But there's no question that modern aviation is just an incredible innovation, right? It powers the global economy, it connects people, families, fosters community, but it's also a significant contributor to emissions. I think Imad's had a slide. The aviation sector alone contributes roughly 3% of total GHG emissions. For the transportation sector, it accounts for 12% roughly of emissions. So it's, and that contribution is only expected to rise as time goes on. Take India, for example, which is a country we operate in. It's currently the third largest aviation market globally, but it's expected to be number one in the near future. Air passenger traffic is expected to reach 400 million passengers by 2030, which is nearly a doubling of pre-pandemic levels. And in terms of fuel consumption, the aviation sector's consumption is going to increase by 8 to 10% annually from here on out. Those are the forecasts. So clearly there's a need for a solution here, and the aviation industry recognizes that, and they've set a target of net zero by 2050, and that's a goal set by the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, as the acronym reads. But the challenge is that aviation is an extremely difficult sector to decarbonize, as is much of transportation. There aren't many sort of levers to pull in order to drive those emissions reductions and that decarbonization. But it's broadly recognized that sustainable aviation fuel is actually a solution, at least for the near term, for affecting some pretty meaningful impact on emissions. But here too is a challenge, because currently there's the industry is at an infancy. There's very limited production available. So for context, the aviation industry consumes roughly 100 billion gallons of fossil jet fuel annually. There's far less than 1% of sustainable aviation fuel available today, right? So there's a huge gap between what's needed and where we are. So that's one issue. The other issue is because it's an industry that's still in its infancy. Cost is higher than fossil jet, and it can be as high as 3x or more, higher 3x or more than fossil jet, because we've yet to kind of slide down that cost curve. And for carriers, that's a big issue, because fuel is one of their largest line items, if not their largest line item from an expense standpoint. So there is a challenge on the cost side, and that's really where having alignment on policy and regulation comes into play to help the industry take flight. You have countries such as the United States that approach it via incentives, sort of a carrot approach. You have other countries that take more of a stick approach with mandates, such as the EU and the UK. So different approaches, but in the end, what they're meant to do is really to drive, help the industry take flight, allow for scale. Once scale occurs, you can see those costs coming down and making it a lot easier for carriers to adopt the fuel. So with that, thank you.
Thanks so much. So much to dig into. Elizabeth, you're filling in for Gia
Yes.
Biaggi.
The secretary was sorry she couldn't be here, but I am very excited to be here in her place. My name is Elizabeth Irvin. I'm Deputy Director in the Office of Planning and Programming at the Illinois Department of Transportation, which is a mouthful of a title, but really my focus for the department is managing sustainable initiatives. So this is my bread and butter all the time. And this role, I've been in this role for about 3 years. It was a new role for the department, established in a moment where we had a lot of federal funds coming to the department to manage new initiatives, lots of new responsibilities as part of the IIJA, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. A lot of that work is still ongoing, despite the change in administration. So that's keeping me very busy and has been over the last few years, especially the NEVI program and EV charging infrastructure. But also this sort of area of freight, emerging technologies is an increasing part of my work as those programs kind of get their wings underneath them. So when I think about sustainability and what that means for the department, it has sort of 4 components. There's the mitigation of climate emissions and mitigation of environmental impacts generally. There's adaptation to a world with changing climate and making sure our infrastructure is ready for that. There's equity and ensuring that the benefits of these transitions are distributed equitably. And then the last thing is sustainability, financial sustainability of the system. And that is a really big priority for a DOT. We have a huge system out there, and the majority of our resources go to maintaining the system we have in the condition it's currently in, let alone all these new innovative things that we want to be able to do. So what are the levers that we really have as a DOT to push innovation in this space? There are really 3 that I can think of. There's funding, that's a big one. There's policy, and then there's planning. Obviously, I'm an urban planner by background, and I'm in the Office of Planning and Programming, so I got to talk about that. So I may just sort of leave it there. One more observation is that one of the great things about my role is that I am working across a lot of silos. Transportation departments and government in general often tends to be pretty siloed by mode, by sort of agency between the public and the private sector, and this area of work really requires a lot of collaboration across all those things. New partners, working with existing partners in new ways. So happy to talk about that a little more as we get into the discussion.
Fantastic. Okay, I've got so many questions listening to your fantastic intros. The first is, for those of us who don't know, what is sustainable aviation? Like, what are these alternate fuels that Finnair or LanzaJet can be working with?
Well, I can start, and then probably you can chip in with the molecule level discussion. So sustainability, it's actually a more complicated question than you might imagine, because when we talk about sustainable aviation fuel, or what can be produced and put in an airplane today, people tend to think that means it makes that flight carbon free or CO2 free, and that's actually not the case. What it means is, from the time you produce it to the time, well to wake is what they call it, so from the time you produce it to the time it's actually burned, it should burn less CO2 per unit, per RTK, than the current fuels do. There is another type of sustainable aviation fuel, it's called eSAF, which actually should bring us much closer to the goal of no emissions whatsoever, but those don't come from biofuels, they don't come from waste products, they don't come from cooking oils and things like that. Those will be made in a different process, but they will be made from hydrogen as a source of energy, et cetera, et cetera. So right now, when we talk about sustainable aviation fuel, it's sustainable for now, but we need to move to a point where it's actually truly much more sustainable than the Jet A that we have today, than the kerosene we have today. At the same time, we are still trying to get everything together to make SAF as we know it. eSAF is going to have to be the next step after that. But Eric, I think you're on a molecule level discussion much more open to that.
So I mean, there are what are known as different pathways for producing sustainable aviation fuel from different sources of feedstock, from carbon through to used cooking oil. But I think the governing kind of construct is rather than unearthing carbon that's been buried for thousands and thousands of years to produce fuel, you're essentially recycling carbon from whether it's agricultural residue, it can be municipal solid waste, it can be industrial emissions. But what you're doing is you're recycling carbon that's already in the sort of the circular atmosphere, if you will. So that's really the big delta. Like when a plane flies and burns sustainable aviation fuel, there are still emissions, but those emissions have come from fuel that is based on recycling versus unearthing and creating new fuel.
So that's the goal, to get us to net zero emissions by 2050. What are the most promising paths as you see it right now?
So I'll comment briefly, and then Christina, because I'm sure you look at it, but sustainable aviation fuel is recognized as sort of one of the primary drivers, particularly for long haul flights. Just given the physics of air travel, using batteries for long haul travel
get heavy
or flights
and
is just not possible. Hydrogen is a vexing challenge. Airbus had a big initiative on hydrogen. They've pulled back because it's a very difficult proposition. We may get there, but
difficult primarily why?
I'm sorry?
Difficult primarily why?
So I mean,
without getting too technical for those of us.
Well, no, but at a most basic level, hydrogen is it's a very slippery molecule, and it's also very combustible.
So that the plane could explode.
Yeah.
Safety.
Safety. Yeah, in many ways, yes. And then there are other there's gains you can make through more intelligent routing of flights, gains based on sort of ground operations, but it really is, fuel is the primary driver.
Got it.
So yeah, fuel is going to be the primary driver to get us to net zero by 2050. But as you mentioned, there are things that we can do as airlines, and we are doing right now today to make the aircraft lighter. So we wash it more often, believe it or not, because dirt weighs something. It makes it more aerodynamic.
Sorry, washing the plane?
Washing the airplane, believe it or not, yeah.
Okay,
And I mean,
I
I
had
know
no
the whole
idea.
water thing, but actually, net, keeping the aircraft clean is very beneficial. Taxiing on one engine instead of both engines, so when you're trying to get to the runway, you only use one engine. There are even electric pushback vehicles that are unmanned entirely. We are starting to see those at some airports. Again, you're not using the fuel, so that's also a good thing. They have a continuous descent approach. It's the way the aircraft lands on the runway that will burn less fuel. It takes advantage of the fact that it can glide a little bit. This also has a noise impact. It's less noisy to do that. Of course, you can't do that everywhere because some communities prefer different routings into the airport where they serve. But of course, all of that feeds into burning less fuel and making the aircraft lighter. There's also new aircraft technology coming on. You touched on that a little bit in terms of hydrogen aircraft, electric aircraft. Those are pretty far in the future from what we see right now. And so that leaves sustainable aviation fuel, which is something that can be dropped into the aircraft tank today. Most engines today can handle at least a 50% Jet A and sustainable aviation fuel mix today to get us to where we need to be in terms of net zero. But it's very much a piecemeal approach. There's no silver bullet here. And I think we spent a lot of time early on in the sustainability discussion in transportation and aviation specifically, and maybe you can comment too, talking about, okay, what's the silver bullet? What's going to solve this for us? And the answer is there's no one solution. It's going to have to be sort of step by step by step, and we eventually get to where we need to be.
Got it. All right, go ahead.
Can I mention something?
I was going to say for what's great being between rail discussion, air discussion is the railroad is kind of similar. We at CSX, we burn over 1 million gallons a day of diesel fuel. Diesel fuel accounts for over 75% of my total greenhouse gas inventory. So any drop, any gallon that we can reduce reduces my overall footprint, and that's true for the entire rail industry. And as far as levers, decarbonization levers, we kind of are in the same boat. It's operational efficiencies. It is automatic start-stop. It's things that you do in your car that we can do in a big, humongous locomotive engine that actually give us 5 million gallons of savings a year, and we can go further. And then similar to SAF, biodiesel, renewable diesel are drop-in solutions today. The price parity is not exactly there yet, but those are the immediate levers that we have. And then maybe easier than changing an aircraft engine, changing a locomotive engine is maybe a little easier. The traction motors really just want electricity. So I can easily swap out that diesel engine for batteries, for hydrogen fuel cell, and that's what's happening today. So we're maybe a little easier to get to a zero emission solution because we just want electricity. The interesting note about the weight, a train wants more weight. I get more traction power from a heavier engine. A heavier battery in my locomotive is fine. I would like more weight because that lets a locomotive pull more freight behind it. So we're at kind of an advantage in that situation. And it's just really interesting of how we can just use it differently. The bigger problem for the rail industry is to completely decarbonize. It's thinking about the number of engines or locomotives that have to be converted. Our company has over 3,500 locomotives. I have 3 hydrogen fuel cell locomotives. So the amount of time to build those, operationalize them, and get them on the market is the challenge for this industry. The other thing that a lot of people don't realize is there's a lot of interoperability between all of the railroads. When a train comes into Chicago, for example, it may have 4 engines on them. We swap them from CSX to BNSF or UP or CN. Sometimes those engines go with them. So if I am creating a brand new fuel or that engine is something super special and it can only burn hydrogen and I pass it off to a railroad that can't do hydrogen, that's at a disadvantage. We all have to be in that same playing field with the technology.
Yeah, so just to build on that, Becky mentioned that sustainable aviation fuel is a drop-in fuel, which means that it can leverage the existing infrastructure and logistics, whereas hydrogen cannot. So similar problem if you let's say you were flying a hydrogen-powered aircraft from point A to point B. You might be able to fuel it in point A, but you get to point B and they don't have that infrastructure. So SAF can ride on that existing infrastructure, which is a huge advantage.
Ahmad?
Yeah, I would like to comment on the aviation part. I think we have to look at it where that airport is, and accordingly we can decide which fuel we're going to be using. For example, if we are looking into Hawaii and Alaska, 56% of their emission is coming from aviation. And these are places where you can be traveling by electrical aviation soon. Some of my colleagues, they are working on this and they are expecting that you will be flying from Champaign to Dallas using electrical airplane, which we're talking here about short distances within the next 7 to 10 years. So these are possibility, given here that the current fuel that we're using for the aviation is what we call it the kerosene type. And this is more damaging actually to the environment. So the alternatives right now, if we look at the hydrogen, which I agree with my colleagues, it's going to be saving the environment maybe 80%, but there is some disadvantages at this point. Electrical, they may be saving up to 10% in the emission, but they have to be used in areas where I think they're going to be the best to use, as the examples I gave you, where we have short distances or the emission that is coming from the transportation that it's related to aviation is more than half, like the 2 states that I gave. If you have a place like Illinois, for example, the aviation emission that we're getting is 17% because we do have a very busy airport, but that's not the case. The same thing I can say about Europe. I did look into many cases in countries of Europe, so it depends how busy that airport. And accordingly, we need to think about different alternatives that it works with the trips that it's intended. That's my suggestion.
Okay, well, speaking of flights from Chicago to Champaign that could be electrified.
This is electrical for sure.
Well,
And the president, he's going to buy one for University of Illinois.
So who's ever been to Champaign, Illinois? Raise your hands. Okay,
Wow.
I went, my daughter graduated just now, and it's a really boring drive from Chicago to Champaign. When do we get high-speed rail, Elizabeth, from Chicago to Champaign?
Well, we did increase the speeds on Amtrak relatively. We worked with Amtrak at IDOT to increase the speeds on a lot of the state in-state recently. So hopefully it's a little bit better these days. We're doing a lot of planning around rail. I am not involved in the high-speed rail conversations, but I think for some of those short, it is about mode shift.
Yep,
right?
the mode shift, absolutely.
It's the same thing we were talking
That's
about with shifting from truck to rail. There's some pretty significant savings just from doing that. And I think that is the role for the DOT is doing that long-range planning, kind of being prepared for what are the technologies that are out there, understanding what infrastructure investments make sense. Maybe makes sense right now for us to do, what makes sense for us to help fund some pilots, and where do we think gaps are going to show up that the public sector really needs to step in. We've been really working through that on the EV, the passenger side, the EV charging side of things, the chicken and egg between nobody wants to get the car because they're worried about is the infrastructure going to be there. Nobody wants to invest in the infrastructure because the cars aren't necessarily there yet, and that's where a critical role for the government to step in and try to fix those inefficiencies and yeah.
I don't know if anybody's read the book Abundance or just heard the podcasts about it, but one of Ezra Klein's biggest complaints is that California has been trying to get high-speed rail forever, and yet there are all of these impediments. What, from your point of view as a planner, what are those impediments? I think I wrote about Chicago's plans for sustainability and whether we hit those markers by 2020, I think it was 2020 when I did the story. And one of them was high-speed rail to St. Louis. From your point of view, from your eagle eye point of view, we're just like, oh, why didn't it happen? But what do you see as the biggest challenges to get those kinds of things done?
I think one of them is just when you talk about time in the transportation field, what counts as like a short amount of time for transportation investment, and you sort of alluded to this when you're talking about freight railroad transition for fleets, like 20 years is like that. When you're talking about transportation investments, it often takes a lot, there's the planning phase, there's the engineering that goes into making things work, there's figuring out how do you fit this plan that we have with the funding that's coming in and make that work on your calendars based on all of, as I mentioned, maintaining the system as it is, making sure that people aren't falling into potholes, that the bridges are staying up, that sort of bread and butter. So it's really a puzzle piece of how do you make these really needed investments that aren't necessarily the things that are like shrieking in your face every day of we got to keep the system running and functioning. So I think that's sort of the fundamental challenge. Sorry, my brain just.
I mean, he pointed, and I think a lot of people here at this conference specifically would agree that environmental assessments are important. But one of the things he said, there was environmental assessment after environmental assessment, and that's why California never got high-speed rail. And it's, the push and pull there. But we could argue about that forever.
And I will say we've been with I'll again go back to the sort of the passenger EV construction. So yes, all of the EV charging infrastructure through NEVI needs to go through a NEPA environmental review process. These are charging stations that are going in existing parking lots. They're not necessarily what you would think of as like needing a huge amount of environmental assessment. So one of the things we did early on was say, how can we streamline this? And we created a form that was like, how do we explain, so the people who are building these charging stations, plain English, these are the 8 questions we need you to answer, and we'll process this form and we can hopefully get your review expedited. And we've been able to get most of those through review in a couple of months, where they might have otherwise taken a lot longer if you're talking like a big roadway project.
The streamlines, and regulation is something I really do want to get to because I think it's really important. And Maud, you mentioned a term called platooning that I'd never heard of.
Okay.
So it's just bunching a whole bunch of trucks together?
Right now, if you are traveling on interstate, you always see truckers trying to drive behind each other.
Oh.
By nature. Try to look from now on and you will see
no idea.
that, yes. You will notice that because they are smart and they know that the guy who's driving behind the first truck, they're going to be saving fuel. And this fuel
and for the dummies among us,
Yes.
just me probably, is it because less
it's
wind
because
or
of
something?
the drag forces.
From
so there
wind.
will be less drag forces on the second one. So in this case, they will be saving fuel. And this fuel, it varies from 5% to 12%.
No idea.
So it
Wow.
depends how many trucks you have behind. So the first one will be saving a little bit because of the forces that it's going to come back, but the ones after that, they're going to be saving significantly. Now, the current distance between these trucks is between 200 to 250 feet. Theoretically, they can go up to 10 feet in between, but we are suggesting that they get to be between 50 to 100. So there is 3 factors that impact this. First is the speed of the trucks. The second is the distance between the trucks. And the third is what is the wander. We call it the wander, which is the distance in the direction, perpendicular to the direction of the traffic. So between these 3 factors, we can optimize to make sure that the damage to the infrastructure is going to be less. And we show that this can be reduced by 30% on the depression that you have, and that can be also, for the cracking, less 70%. So this is, in my opinion, a textbook case where you can change a challenge like this to an opportunity if you work on it and you design it. And in the state of Illinois, we are the first state actually to design for the platoons, that we have a design ready for it. And at the same time, we know which interstates are platoonable and how much we can allow, or how we can allow the trucks if they can platoon on these roads or not.
Got it. And so those of us who were taught, say 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi between you and the next car, it's not too close. Like what if one guy slams on the brakes, then it was these are trucks that they're going to be connected, so they will be able to connect all this information among themselves. Oh, so like they'll be
So it's not
communicating.
that this guy will be slamming the brakes. Now, from a logistics point of view, because we're talking about the logistics, what I'm seeing in the future, the problem is going to be trucks from different companies, they're going to be platooning, and now they're going to start negotiating who's going to be the second place, who's going to be the third place. I mean, this is another thing that they're going to be work it out in the future for sure.
Fascinating. I'll have to write
Yep.
about that. All right, well, let's get to freight and regulations. Should we talk freight or regulations? Raise your hand for freight. Raise your hand for regulation. Okay, you guys are not participating. My hand.
You're the audience.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Oh, and we are going to take questions from you guys. Well, so obviously we are entering a time when the United States is not exactly on board with global goals on the environment, and frankly, Illinois is not in line anymore with some of the national goals on the environment, many of which are being rolled back. How do you navigate those challenges when it's not uniform across the board? Anybody want to talk about that?
I'll start a little
Yeah.
bit because one of the other sessions I sat in on was sustainability reporting. So again, maybe we don't have SEC disclosures in the US, but we are aligning for global standards and global guidance for science-based targets and for some other programs like that. So that, in that, I think majority of companies are, again, aligning for global standards and reporting, which is great. Here in the US, and let's go back to fuel, we are, as a company, I know you guys are too, tracking DC and what's going on for renewable fuel standards, and then tracking state by state for low carbon fuel standards. So that translates to dollars spent or saved for my company, because that price differential, and if there's any tax incentives for the different low carbon fuels, we want to know, and if it's going to happen in Illinois versus happen in other states that we operate in, that's going to help us determine where we're going to buy our fuel and where we're maybe going to first fuel those locomotives.
All right, regulation?
Yeah.
You go.
I guess I'll start and just say, I think Illinois, we're lucky to be in a state where there's a lot of leadership and commitment to continuing to meet those goals. We still have a state goal to meet the Paris Climate Agreement. There's an executive order signed by the governor to meet that goal.
I didn't know that, so Illinois is still on track for Paris.
Well, we've committed to it. We've actually, and actually there was a lot of work during the last administration to get at least Illinois' fair share of all the federal funding, if not more than that. A lot of that funding we actually secured before the administration changed, so I can run through a few programs that we're working on. So low carbon transportation materials, we have about almost $32 million to spend on both collecting data and incentivizing lower carbon concrete, steel, asphalt, the materials that go into making our system. The state, this was the Illinois EPA, has a climate pollution reduction grant, implementation grant that they received that's focused on a couple areas around reducing emissions, and the areas are building energy as well as freight. So there's programs related to one of the big things is a freight concierge system. So we've got lots of big operators in the freight ecosystem, but we also have a ton of small operators who are interested in being more sustainable fuels. So this is a initiative that'll help those operators understand what their options are. So that work's continuing to go on. We're still doing climate planning with some of that funding. We've got a Clean Ports program. Our NEVI funding, while it's currently caught up in some legal, we're part of one of the lawsuits.
NEVI stands for?
Thank you. The National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, so that's EV charging infrastructure. So some of that funding has been frozen by the administration. We're part of a number of states that is suing the administration over that funding. But while that legal battle is playing out, we're continuing to move forward, evaluating projects, and committed to using the resources we have in the state to continue to move forward. So just because there's a change at the federal level, there's still a ton going on locally.
Yep.
Okay, regulation challenges, anyone?
I alluded to the fact that, on a cost of production basis, sustainable aviation fuel is more expensive than fossil jet fuel. But, and that's really where sort of the policy, regulatory, the incentive schemes become really important. In the United States, it's really an incentive model versus a stick model. And then there's opportunities at the federal level, and then there's opportunities at the state level, and these opportunities can also be stacked to bring down the cost of sustainable aviation fuel. The challenge right now is as part of the big beautiful bill, there's just a lot of uncertainty around some of the tax credits tied to fuel and sustainable aviation fuel. It literally changed again yesterday based on what our understanding was. So it's just, at this point, we're kind of just stepping back and seeing how it all falls out. The good news at the federal level is there is a renewable fuel standard where if you produce fuel based on certain sort of parameters and criteria, you can earn what are known as RINs. RINs have value, RINs are tradable. And that program is actually more lucrative than, at least for us, what 45Z, which is the kind of the paragraph of the big beautiful bill that's relevant. So there's that level, but then in states like Illinois, which is terrific, there's a $1.50 per gallon tax credit available, which is really meaningful when you start kind of looking at the cost of production and sort of what kind of incentives you can align against that. So and you're seeing more Illinois is an early leader in that. You're seeing more states coming forward with similar types of sort of tax incentives and tax credits that are available, which is really helpful for the industry.
So let's add on to that the voluntary market for carbon credits.
Of course. Yes.
And I think what is an interesting space, because if there's money to be made off of something, and if we can monetize to help move the needle for sustainability, I think that's there. I think maritime industry was one of the first to do kind of a book and claim concept. So when you are burning and directly consuming that fuel, or even whether it's going into, this is true for the aviation industry, if you're burning it directly, you can assume and book the carbon attributes or the environmental attributes of that fuel. And when you book that, that creates a certificate that is then transferable or sellable on the market. And so the concept of book and claim, again, not new. It's maybe new for rail. One of our competitors, Norfolk Southern, stepped into this market earlier this year, but maritime, aviation, trucking are already kind of in the space. So book and claim gives the opportunity for us to maybe pay a little more, a premium for that fuel, and then transfer or sell that carbon credit to the shipper. In my example, it would be shippers on rail. If they have a net zero target, they want to pay a premium for a zero carbon transportation. So scope 3, category 3 is where that plugs in. So they buy that credit and they get to remove that from their accounting. So it comes from carbon accounting into there's financial accounting in there too, but it's a really interesting space to be watching how we move this.
Yeah, and we're seeing roughly, pricing at like from $2.50 to $3.50 per gallon for those sort of environmental attributes. The purchasers have been typically, you're seeing some of the large technology companies pretty active in terms of purchasing these scope 3 credits. Firms that have workforces that spend a lot of time in the air, think professional services firms, they've been pretty active buyers, but again at $2.50 to $3.50 a gallon, depending on the quality of the credit, that can go a long way towards buying down the cost of, in our case, sustainable aviation fuel. So,
Christy, did you want to comment on the global versus?
Yeah, there's aviation is a very regulated industry, so we are not unused to being regulated everywhere we fly, and many places that we don't. What the sustainability landscape has really brought to us is the reporting requirement. So for example, we might fly to a small airport in Austria, and we might have to have an aircraft that is specially designed to land on that runway, but we don't have to report it, and we don't have to prove that aircraft can land on that runway to our auditors. And now we are in a place in the industry where we now have an audit standard for some of the measures that we're taking. So we have to have a different conversation with respect to the regulations and the regulatory bodies than we've been having before, because we have a higher standard of proof to our auditors, frankly, first, and to our investors second. So in a way, it's kind of become a two-sided conversation. Before, it was complying with the regulations that we have, trying to make sure that the regulators understood the constraints that we deal with and finding the right way through. And now it's much more trying to influence the conversation, because as the panelists have pointed out, there are very, very different regulatory environments depending on whether you're in the United States, whether you're in Europe, whether you're in Asia, or whether you're somewhere else. So for example, in Europe, there's a blending mandate for fuel. So you have to have at least 2% of the fuel in your airplane or your airport provided has to be sustainable aviation fuel. So that is a mandate. You are penalized if you don't comply with it as a fuel supplier in an airport. Well, they didn't say anything about what that had to cost, and I guess to Eric, to your point, it cost what they wanted to cost. That puts us at a disadvantage versus airlines that fly in from, let's say, the United States, where that might be subsidized to a higher degree, where we're actually paying for it. That's the conversation, I think, Becky, that you were talking about, that kind of goes in the middle, which is, you know, if we need to do this, we need to make sure that the regulations are aligned and that we're all kind of aiming for the same thing. And that's for us the biggest challenge, because I guess I didn't realize it, the big bill had changed something else again yesterday. But you know, that's the kind of thing where when you have an audit standard, it becomes extremely important that you're able to comply with it and that you're able to prove that you comply with it. And that has changed the conversations that we're having with regulators.
And then even more, you're auditing to a standard, and some of those regulatory requirements are moving as they're moving as you're auditing, and so that just makes your life harder.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think regulations is always a very tough topic. So I'm going to put the professor hat for a minute here. I think our job is to provide the scientific background that will allow people to make the right decision. So in any project we conduct at our center, it has to have 3 items. First, it must be the outcome economic, it must be sustainable, and it's going to be implementable. So if you have a science and this science is not turned to a policy, there is a problem. It's going to be always a science. But if you have a policy or regulations that is not based on science, it's going to be empirical, and it could be detrimental at some point in the future. So our role is to provide with all the right information that will allow you all to make the right decision about moving forward in your policy.
But to add on that, let's bring supply chain into the whole mix,
Sure.
right? So what the global standards kind of are trying to influence is that all of these connected pieces parts are all aligning either from science-based targets or carbon reduction. And
Absolutely.
so some of what TCFD, CDP, what they're trying to do is say, hey, company, are you influencing your suppliers? And where are you, how are you using your weight essentially to move this? And what's interesting being as a freight operator, a railroad, as we get that push from our shippers. We move a lot of automobiles, we move a lot of petroleum products, we move a lot of freight. Our customers are layering their requirements on us. We in turn are layering our requirements down to our suppliers. And so all together we have this opportunity to kind of decarbonize this entire value chain, entire supply chain. And it's being in my position, it's really interesting to watch and experience. And then you have that investor influence as well to help kind of keep pushing the needle. So it's more than regulations. It's what is your economic influence in your supply chain.
But if I may add on this, I think the most important thing for the supply chain also is to be able to choose what is the proper mode of transportation for that product. And that's the project that I mentioned. Actually, one of my colleagues is here. He's leading that project. So we are developing a database, and this database is going to be real-time database that will allow you to find the different modes of transportation, and you will decide which one's going to be more economical, and we have a model that is going to optimize this based on the cost and the emission. And hopefully we'll be able to test this in Chicago and LA. So I think you put what you mentioned here, the availability of the fuel or the FAS, so on, along with what we are doing for the supply chain, that will make this a complete story.
Yeah.
And will that algorithm also factor in local regulations every step of the way along that?
It should be, absolutely. Yep. I mean, that's the whole idea, is we are making this localized and try to scale it up for the national, for the whole United States. But at least we're looking at 2 test beds here because we have the data. Example, we have the detection of the freight data in LA. We have 22 weigh in motion, which measure the weights of the trucks here in Illinois. So we're collecting all this data, and that's why we're using this as a test bed, and then that will be scaled up for the whole country.
Sounds like a lot of moving parts to
Yes,
keep track of.
absolutely.
And as someone who had to change her lead story at 1 a.m. 2 nights ago because of changes in national policy, I can appreciate it on a small scale what you must be dealing with watching this bill go through.
Yep.
That is going to affect sustainable transportation a lot.
Absolutely.
So going from the global to the local, in the last General Assembly, sorry for non-Illinoisans here, but in the last General Assembly, they did not pass an RTA funding and reform bill. And when I was talking to Illinois environmentalists, they said it's huge because I didn't know, and I think your slides actually, Maud, pointed to it, that transportation is the largest contributor of greenhouse gas in the state. And so what are those challenges on an Illinois transportation point of view to getting us to more sustainable transportation from Springfield?
Yeah, I mean, I think the funding is always the tough part of the conversation. I think there was a bill that passed it was the sort of more of the governance side of things. There's been a lot of discussion over the years about how do we need to change our especially in the Chicago region. We have 3 different transit agencies that all serve different purposes. Are there more efficient ways that we can provide that service? So I think there's been more agreement on how to do that part of it. And then the question always comes back to the how do we fund it, and really put our money where our priorities are. The challenge on transit has been, and this is true in a lot of, it's not just a Illinois or Chicago problem. So especially if you're in the U.S., but I think internationally, since COVID, there's been a decline in ridership. Which, especially if you're in a state like Illinois, where the transit agencies are required to meet a certain amount of their revenue, or their costs make up a certain amount of that from fare revenue. So if your fare revenue is going down, you're in a place where, okay, now do we have to cut service? And then you get in a negative cycle of the less service.
Death spiral.
Exactly. And so it's a challenging place to be in when we really, from a climate perspective, kind of want to go the other direction. So I think there's been a lot of discussion about how do we support this. The other challenge is that just funding sources, some of them are flexible, but some of them aren't. The operations, so everybody wants to pay for building stuff, right? Like buying a bus, putting down rail, building a road, but there's a huge cost, especially on the transit side, in operations, so paying the bus driver. The bus is no good if you don't have a bus driver. And the funding for operations is really where the challenge lies. So I think that's the continued conversation. And I know legislators and advocates, and we're part of these conversations, are continuing to meet to try to figure out how do we solve this crisis.
And a lot of, just like I didn't know washing a plane was a big contributor to helping it be more sustainable. There was Alderman Bill Conway introduced legislation to really crack down on smoking on the CTA. And smoking, why does that have to do with sustainability? Well, if people are smoking all the time on the train, then people don't want to ride, and then people don't pay fares, and then they don't have money to run the system. And so these are all factors that you don't really think about that go into sustainable transportation. Luckily, my train this morning, I'm doing a series called the Red Line Report, and it's like, did I smell pee? Did I smell smoke? Was it on time? Was there someone in need of social services? And I'm telling the CTA, where they're improving, where they're not. Okay, we are going to get to audience questions, and please keep them coming. Can you elaborate on what happens once the carbon credits are sold? Is the money used to invest in green technologies or reforestation?
We don't have it yet, but essentially what it does is it helps offset the price of the fuel. And then we are potentially going to be able to do it for a battery electric locomotive, a hydrogen fuel cell locomotive. Those locomotives are millions of dollars more expensive than a diesel locomotive. So for a company's financial department to approve these projects that are 2 and 3 times more expensive than a traditional locomotive, you need a way to offset all those costs. And so that's kind of where it is to help offset that internally on that balance sheet.
I just one comment on this. I think this is where we always like to look at the holistic life of buying like locomotive. For example, if they're going to be upfront a very expensive price, you pay for it, but over the time it's going to be reduced. So that's why we need to look at the holistic life for it.
Anybody else want to talk about carbon credits?
We don't sell carbon credits, but we do sell SAF. So we offer our customers, both on the cargo side and the passenger side, the opportunity to buy sustainable aviation fuel, and we use that money to actually buy sustainable aviation fuel.
All right. Okay, how has the recent Supreme Court decision on NEPA to streamline the environmental review process changed the transportation infrastructural conversation? And is this a necessary deregulatory step, or does this compromise our environment?
You're going to start, Elizabeth.
I can start. I will put a disclaimer up front, which is that I am not a NEPA expert. There are people who spend their whole careers understanding all of the ins and outs of NEPA. So I think we're still kind of getting our arms around what this means, especially because so many of these things are caught up in continued legal challenges. I know our staff had just gotten their arms around guidance from CEQ, the new guidance from CEQ, Council on Environmental Quality, from the last administration, and how to incorporate climate into some of our NEPA processes. So it takes a minute for us to kind of get our hands around what the federal requirements are.
And can we just recap on what that Supreme Court decision did for those who know?
I don't remember the details. My other disclaimer is I have a 6-month-old at home. So
I'm surprised you're operating at all. If Nicole is here, could Nicole help us understand? And I'm sorry that I did not keep track of exactly what that Supreme Court decision said. Or maybe it's someone who is watching this on the live stream. Well, I assume that it reduced environmental review requirements at the federal level.
I don't know exactly what it did to reduce. I can give an example of how the NEPA review potentially pauses and causes that delay in a project. And so the challenge, and this came up, let's say even on the California high-speed rail project, of that NEPA review and any permitting review, it just puts a pause on what you're able to do. And so when you're estimating a project that potentially is a 3 to 5 year project, any day you waste, your costs are going up, your labor is going up, your economic payback is going down because all of those things are delayed. So any efficiencies that can be added into the NEPA process, not that we are cutting corners or trying to evade a regulation, it is a really high, and sometimes there's 3 and 4 iterations of the NEPA process. They'll come back months later, ooh, we didn't catch this one thing, we got to go back and add that in. So again, to just streamline it, make it more efficient, and make sure anybody working on a large project knows exactly what they're having to deal with up front is I think the bigger possible benefit for the greater community.
I mean, that was sort of the narrative of Ezra Klein's book. You know, everybody wants high-speed rail. High-speed rail could be fantastic for the environment, but ironically, are environmental reviews stopping this great thing for the environment from happening? And that's the big question. You know, is this, as Nicole says, is this a necessary deregulatory step, or does it compromise our environment, or can both of those things be true? Okay, from the Illinois Clean and Equitable Jobs Act to the Inflation Reduction Act, it seems like the government investment that has jump-started a lot of these sustainable mobility efforts. Is this just the launch phase, or do you think long-term success depends on the public sector buy-in? If so, how do we navigate policy volatility?
I'll just go back to the area that I've been working on the most on this, which is EV charging infrastructure. I mean, I think it's a great example of the NEVI, National EV Infrastructure Program, is funding for the first 5 years of operation and maintenance of stations. It's not the government's, or at least the state's government's, idea to like own and operate EV charging stations for the general public on into the future. So there really does, our role is to kind of jumpstart these technologies and fill the gaps. There may be some places where beyond that there needs to still be some government support to make sure that some communities aren't completely left behind as technology evolves. But I think it is really important that this is a public-private sector dialogue, and not that like we're going to just drop the ball. To the point about volatility is, doing those long-term plans, having some certainty on both sides as much as we can, so that we can plan for a future where these things can get sort of spun off and are viable on their own, and government resources can turn to kind of the next new innovations.
I've got a little to add because we were part of a CRISI grant process. What a lot of people don't realize is those grant windows open up for a very, very short period of time. And unless you have essentially a shovel-ready project, you are at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
So that door opens and closes really fast, and the grant we were awarded, we submitted in 2022, it was awarded in 2023, it has not yet been fully inked. And so when you are waiting that long on an innovation project, that innovation moves fast. And so if you are relying on those dollars to actually start that project, you've missed the train, you've missed the boat, you've missed the plane.
So to speak.
Yeah, so I think that's the hard part of it. They're so well intentioned, but there's so much work and administrative support that's got to go into them that we need things to move faster.
Yeah, it's the constant challenge between our role as government of being a good steward of federal and state resources and moving fast, and how do you do both of those adequately?
Yeah. So, with sustainable aviation fuel, and frankly with a lot of other sort of emerging technologies, whether it's energy storage or hydrogen or what have you, traditional investment or investors are pretty conservative. And if you're building a gigafactory for making advanced batteries or building a biorefinery for sustainable aviation fuel, these investors they have appetite to fund that if this is your second, third, fourth, fifth facility that you're building. If this is your first facility or your second facility, they're very loath to take on that risk. So that's where the programs like the DOE loan programs office, that was a very powerful mechanism for getting some of these, call it first of a kind projects up and running, because the traditional private capital markets just don't have the appetite to step in and do that. Right. So it's a real shame to see kind of those programs under attack, because there's a lot of really, really powerful technology and innovation that may not see the light of day because they can't get those early dollars to get it to a point where traditional investors are willing to step in and fund. So.
The other thing on innovation, I mean, again, I appreciate this conference, and there's a lot of people in the academic field are like, you need to try it. You need to fail. If you're going to fail fast and move on and learn from those. And I think that's where, especially in the innovation space for sustainability, you need to learn, and you need those dollars to be able to learn and research and develop and create that next solution that's going to take us further.
All right, but we don't have any people who want to raise their hand and ask a question. I know the organizers told me to look on here. Okay, question? Just shout it out.
I heard a lot about human mobility. I did not hear more about freight mobility, which is most important and keeps the green supply chain there.
So you want to hear more about green freight mobility?
Green freight mobility. I will say what the challenge is, again, is having that solution that is decarbonization for the freight industry is renewable fuels. That's our best lever. Biofuels, biodiesel, that's the immediate. And then that long term is going to be, this is where I put the poll. If anybody was paying attention, I actually added a poll. So again, as the freight industry, we're working on locomotives that can run for 50 years. So if your car is going to run for 50 years, you're not shopping for a new car, even if it is maybe zero emissions. And so the challenge for the industry right now is to, one, be better, more efficient operating, lower the fuel, less idling, lower emissions. Maybe it is carbon capture. Maybe it is a regular diesel electric engine that you can inject hydrogen, that you can inject other fuels to kind of offset and decarbonize where you can. To get to a zero emissions fleet across the entire US. If anybody follows the space, there was a big study that was done about how can you electrify the entire freight industry. And then the cost of that is trillions and trillions of dollars. And so do we have enough energy to electrify the entire freight industry? Probably not, especially if we're going to be in competition with AI. So these are just big problems. But I will say, with the freight industry, we do work together through the AAR, and a lot gets published on aar.org if you're tracking for more of these numbers. But we do work together as the Class 1s. We have what's called a decarbonization working group. And so speaking to interoperability, speaking to what is going to be the best fuel, making sure we're all calculating things the same way, making sure carbon intensity for those biofuels are being used the same way in our inventories. Those are things that we're doing now, which will help move us forward in that direction. We don't know what the answer is yet, which is kind of the problem. If we knew, hey, it's going to be a Tesla locomotive, if we knew it was going to be a hydrogen fuel cell locomotive, that would be easy. What is, I'll say, a positive light is we are working together. So at CSX, we're working with a competitor, CPKC. We're doing hydrogen fuel cell locomotives. We're building them ourselves. We're not having to rely on an outside OEM and manufacturer. We're able to build them in-house. The other sustainability piece for that is railroads are 80% union workforce. It is a union workforce mechanical team building that next innovative engine, and it is a traditional diesel mechanic who is now finding the answers to make a hydrogen fuel cell work better in that locomotive space. So these are all very positive stories, for all the negative, dark things happening in the world. There's some great innovation that's happening with, again, railroad's 200-year-old company. So there's a lot of great positive out there. Hope that helps.
And
yeah, I'll go. Most of the freight is going through trucks, and there is, in my opinion, I think we should be moving into electrification. I gave you some of the cons if we are moving into electrification, which can be overcome. But the most important thing here is we're going to be reducing the emissions significantly, but we need to be mindful where this electricity is coming from. So if this truck is in Vermont, it's completely renewable energy, so it's going to be kind of like very, very clean. If it's in Kentucky, it's going to be a little different story because it's going to be coming from coal. Here in Illinois, almost 55% of the energy is coming from nuclear, and only 15% now is coming from coal, and it's going down. So this is one of the biggest advantage that we have. Now, I did mention that there will be an increase in the number of, trips, around 18%, but this is some of the things that we will be overcome as we are moving forward, because in the next 5 years, I'm expecting there will be a reduction in the battery weight. Another thing in the state of Illinois, actually it's just last 2 weeks, we did develop a way that we can design for the electrical trucks. One of the things that of concern to us was like, when you go to a bus stop, you always find some kind of shoving, and that's because of acceleration and stopping and so on. Trucks usually takes like regular trucks, it takes 60 seconds to get to 60 miles an hour. Electrical trucks is going to take 20 seconds. That's going to be a major problem for the road, and now we are suggesting what kind of materials, like you mentioned that we're going to be looking into sustainable materials. We're suggesting what kind of materials they should be using on the roads. So all these things are addressed as we go, but to get to the bottom of this, I think our freight should be more into electrification as we are moving forward, because they're going to be a significant reduction in the carbon.
Okay, Eric, and then we have a question, and then we'll need to wrap up.
Yeah, just one additional comment. What we've witnessed, and I imagine, Christina, you've witnessed it as well, is that the willingness to pay, let's say, a premium for SAF, the freight, people with freight, who are shipping, have a higher willingness to pay than a consumer who is flying, for personal travel or even for business. Part of that is, tied back to like what Becky was mentioning is, the shippers are also being held to kind of higher standards on their sustainability practices by their customers. So therefore, they're reacting and they realize that, okay, we may need to pay a premium to meet these obligations that are imposed on us. So.
All right, question.
Yes, I have a question in regards to the railroad infrastructure, such as the rail ties. Have you considered anything using other than steel, if using concrete rail ties? Are you considering any new materials such as composites?
There.
So the question is whether or not you've considered using other materials for rail ties than steel.
So rail ties are typically wood. Majority of them are timber ties, but we do use concrete ties, and we do use, there is kind of a recycled material, almost like with plastics and rubber and all
Composite?
that together. So a composite tie, thank you.
I actually had this experience in the University of Illinois in Chicago, Department of Engineering, materials, and I saw that we're using all wooden rail ties wrapped up on this composite material made out of volcanic rock, which is basalt fiber, which I'm involved in that, so I'm trying to see if we can get it in Illinois.
All right, you guys should talk. So the gentleman is saying University of Illinois is looking at using old wooden ties to use composite new materials on them. Okay, so lightning round. The one thing you want people to walk away from this panel with in their minds is, let's start at the end, Christy.
There is no silver bullet, but we are going to get there.
Thank you.
And we're going to get there together.
Yeah, this is kind of building upon that. This really has to have a systems thinking approach to it. There's not, a single solution.
Thinking together, agency, academia, industry.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just add, everybody in this room, I think, all of us need more people doing this work.
Yep.
So yeah, come work for the DOT.
All right, thanks. Give a hand to our great panel today. Thanks for coming and enjoy the rest of the day.